MMOs are well known for their expansive and intricate stories, and with those stories sometimes taking years to conclude, what might seem like the final boss may end up being superseded by something far more sinister and meaningful as subsequent patches and expansions are released. With Final Fantasy XIV, this has very much been the case, not least because the game was even relaunched. But beyond that, there have been 4 major expansions, and within each expansion, patches have further extended the notion of the final boss. Within the previous Final Boss Evolution video, we touched upon some of the final bosses associated with Final Fantasy XIV, but to ensure the scope was somewhat controlled, we didn't delve too much deeper. For this video, the shackles are off. So, with that in mind, strap yourselves in as we build upon what was already covered within that previous video to further explore the complete evolution of final bosses with a specific focus on Final Fantasy XIV and its numerous expansions and patches. Oh, and it should go without saying, but please beware of considerable spoilers ahead. With Final Fantasy XIV following in the footsteps of Final Fantasy XI, there was a high degree of anticipation. But due to the game's dismal performance at launch, main story progression took a back seat as the development team attempted to fix more pressing issues. It meant that even though Final Fantasy XIV released towards the end of 2010, it wouldn't be until mid-August 2012, some 653 days later, that players would be able to witness a conclusion to the base game. That conclusion came in the form of a rather lengthy encounter against Nael van Darnus as part of the Riven Road trial, which was added in patch 1.23a. The fight consisted of 2 phases, with the first against Nael van Darnus' standard form. However, within this phase were micro phases. In the initial sense, Nael would only use melee attacks, but after being reduced to 75% of its health, things would kick up a notch. As it progressed, Nael would also be able to summon lunar fragments to aid their cause, and they would deal significant damage if allowed to fall. After being defeated, Nael would request more power, something that would see Nael van Darnus transformed into Nael Deus Darnus. The second phase would play out in similar fashion to the first phase, but from a design perspective, there was an intriguing addition, as Nael Deus Darnus could use Mega Flare, an ability not associated with the final boss since Final Fantasy XII and Mystic Quest before that. Instead of continuing to try and fix Final Fantasy XIV, the development team realised they would need to do a much more literal reset. The result was Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. In reality, many elements did carry over, including Nael van Darnus, but roles were changed according to the new plan, and it meant Nael no longer featured as the final boss for the base game. That role was instead given to a new character called La Habrea. Players were aware of La Habrea throughout much of the story related to the base game, and he would serve as the final boss of the main scenario quest called The Ultimate Weapon that was associated with patch 2.0. The fight, back when A Realm Reborn launched, was associated with the dungeon called the Praetorium. Within, players would need to fight through a gauntlet of bosses that included Nero, Gaius, and Ultimate Weapon before then squaring off against La Habrea. This series featured quite a few interesting nuances in comparison to what had been seen before. For example, La Habrea would have an involvement in the fight against Ultimate Weapon, leading players to believe that once the fight concluded, the story would progress. Another twist was that in the fight that followed, players would not actually be fighting against La Habrea, at least in the literal sense. Instead, players had to fight against Thancred, who was being mind-controlled by La Habrea. This final encounter would also be much easier than the fight against Ultimate Weapon, resurfacing a trait seen a handful of times before, where the final leg of the final boss gauntlet would be more ceremonial than there to push players to the limits of their abilities. As such, the fight against mind-controlled Thancred wasn't all that comprehensive, but there was a connection with Final Fantasy VII. This came through the Shadow Flare ability, which was used by both Thancred, Saphir Sephiroth, and Genesis Avatar. Now, this was how the fight used to be, but due to the ever-evolving nature of Final Fantasy XIV, much of this has changed, and as of patch 6.1, everything just spoken about no longer exists. This means that instead of facing La Habrea as part of a gauntlet within the Praetorium, it's now a solo quest battle that has been elevated in status. As such, the encounter is no longer ceremonial, with La Habrea's ability set expanded in a significant manner, and the encounter having 2 distinct phases. The first phase will be similar to other more recent final boss encounters, with the player taking part in an unwinnable encounter. However, following the intervention of a third party, in this case Hydaelyn, they will be revived and given a second bite of the cherry. During the second phase, the player would receive the Blessing of Light status. This would increase damage and health, making the fight more sustainable. And although La Habrea would put up a significant challenge, the player would be able to overcome the odds. That such a change was made to the makeup of this part of Final Fantasy XIV served as evidence that the development team want to ensure the entire experience is of the highest quality, as opposed to accolades only being geared towards the most recent expansions. Final Fantasy XIV Patch 2.55 was released as part of Before the Fall on the 31st of March 2015. It would signal the conclusion of A Realm Reborn's main scenario, and everything would come to a head during a quest called the Steps of Faith. After the quest commenced, players would get to experience something quite unique. Unlike every previous final boss to have appeared across the breadth of the entire franchise, this would see the player take part in a much larger skirmish, where they would attempt to stop a huge dragon called Vishab from progressing along a specified path. It meant that even though stopping Vishab was the ultimate goal, its large pool of health would make a head-on assault quite difficult. Instead, players would need to combine their efforts with the use of interactive elements such as the Bertha cannons to deal additional damage. Using these interactive elements would also help when dealing with the numerous allies that would accompany Vishab throughout the encounter. Many final bosses had been joined by allies in the past, but for this particular encounter, the sheer scale was unlike anything seen before, as outside of specified mini-bosses such as the Armoured Dragon, there would also be lots of smaller enemies appearing throughout the encounter as an attempt to overwhelm the player party. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the encounter was that Vishab was not at all concerned about defeating the player, but even though that may have been the case, it would still perform offensive actions. This could also lead to a curious scenario, however, as the player could lose without even being defeated by Vishab. Instead, a game over state would be enacted should Vishab reach its destination before being defeated. Although in its initial days the Steps of Faith was meant to be an encounter that offered some variety through its unorthodox mechanics, due to power creep, those mechanics were seldom used in favour of just brute forcing Vishab down. And it was perhaps because of this that in patch 6.2 it was replaced by a solo quest battle. The player would now be joined by numerous NPC allies in a far more structured fight that would see attention focused on the mini-bosses and Vishab as sequential parts of the same encounter, as opposed to them being fought in tandem. The jeopardy would still be there, however, in relation to losing without the player themselves being defeated, as Vishab would need to be felled before the last player ally. Acting as the first major expansion to Final Fantasy XIV, there was heavy focus placed on the story of Heavensward. And as the main scenario quest developed, it became clear that something was afoot with Archbishop Thordan VII. As the story reached its initial conclusion, players confronted their adversary face to face. But as had been seen many times before, the Thordan players knew was not the Thordan they would encounter, as after using Nidhogg's right eye, absorbing the essence of La Habrea, and accessing the power of the Warring Triad, Thordan became an avatar of Thordan the Thirst, aka Primal King Thordan. The developers also chose to go quite hardcore on the notion of allies. Within the previous final boss encounter against Vishab, there had been quite a few notable enemies and numerous cannon fodder. But for this encounter, Thordan would be supported by the Heavensward, a group of 12 knights. This was in itself quite a significant evolution, but it also evolved a notion introduced within Final Fantasy XIII too, as the Heavensward were linked with the power of Thordan's ultimate attack, Knights of the Round. In order to reduce its effectiveness, this would see the player need to defeat each individual summoned knight, with the order of defeat also important for helping to ensure the limit gauge did not increase at a faster rate. The story of Heavensward would reach its conclusion with patch 3.3 dubbed Revenge of the Horde. It would see the player take part in a trial called the Final Steps of Faith, where they would face off against Nidhogg, albeit through another possession. With Estenian having obtained 2 of Nidhogg's eyes, the spirit possessed the fearsome dragoon and subsequently transformed him into its original form as a huge dragon, and what commenced was a pretty epic encounter. By this point in the franchise, multi-phase bosses were nothing new, but seldom were 4 phases used, with Ultima Seer and Benevelza serving as notable examples. With Nidhogg, this trait would return, and what made it quite intriguing was just how different the individual phases would end up being. Similar to the two aforementioned bosses, the first phase would serve as an appetizer. It would see players square off against the final boss in its base form, but the encounter itself would not be too challenging. Once cleared, Nidhogg would retreat, and aligning with Ultima Seer would bring forth allies to fight in its stead. After being defeated, Nidhogg would then revert back to Estenien. This saw the enemy shrink in size, the opposite of what would normally be expected from a mid-boss fight transformation. But even though Estenien was much small in terms of literal size, this phase packed a punch thanks to abilities such as Akmorn. Where things differed, however, was that the final phase wouldn't be all that grand in comparison to previous 4-phase encounters. It would see Nidhogg return, albeit now with an angrier colour palette, and there were a few new moves introduced to complement those used by Nidhogg in the initial phase. Stormblood arrived as the second major expansion to Final Fantasy XIV, and its final boss was quite intriguing. Shinryu was introduced within Heavensward as a very powerful primal, and as the main scenario quest for Stormblood developed, the player would be forced to witness its power firsthand. After having its consciousness overtaken by Xenos, something that had now become a recurring theme for final bosses within Final Fantasy XIV, the player would end up fighting against Shinryu as part of the Royal Menagerie. Here, they would take part in a multi-phase encounter that had an inadvertent resurfacing of the elements often associated with chaos. It would see Shinryu use a multitude of high-tier elemental spells. However, unlike Chaos, who used spells associated with the 4 elements, having absorbed the power of the 4 fiends, Shinryu wielded the power of 6 elemental primals. The other interesting trait of note was Shinryu's size. Even though many prior final bosses would undergo transformations to alter their form, they would seldom dwarf the player in size. Chaos within Dissidia Final Fantasy had served as an exception here, but Shinryu resurfaced this trait in a rather meaningful manner. As the fight progressed, the player would also be forced to adapt to a changing stage, with Shinryu using its size to break various parts. And there would also be an interesting first, as even though active time maneuvers had been seen with a few other Final Fantasy XIV boss encounters, this was the first time a QuickTime event was associated with a final boss. All things considered, by introducing new interpretations of older traits and even bringing some new traits to the table, this all served to make the encounter against Shinryu pretty memorable. As was the case with Heavensward, the finale of Stormblood's story would arrive in patch 4.3, and it would see the player square off against Tsukuyomi, a primal of great power. And this presented a curious twist. Many previous final bosses associated with Final Fantasy XIV were known entities. Time had been taken to introduce them through various narrative means, and although in some instances there were some grand transformations, none really came out of left field. Tsukuyomi was different. Ahead of patch 4.3, this saw Square Enix make no mention of the boss, and information relating to Castrum Fluminis, the trial in which Tsukuyomi would be encountered, was kept under wraps. And this was due to the relationship Tsukuyomi had with Yotsuyu, a known antagonist who had featured throughout Stormblood. Everything would then culminate in a big reveal, with Yotsuyu transforming into Tsukuyomi and challenging the player. The fight itself would have numerous distinct phases. The first phase would be against Tsukuyomi, with the second taking place within Yotsuyu's consciousness, having gained control of her mind. This would then give way to one of the most unique aspects of the fight, Selenomancy. Over the years, numerous boss fights would force players to be aware of their surroundings, with Shinryu even removing parts of the stage, but with Selenomancy, Tsukuyomi would split the stage in half, penalising players for spending too long within each half. This would see the encounter end on a high note from a gameplay perspective, with that sentiment carrying over to the narrative upon its conclusion. The third major expansion to Final Fantasy XIV, dubbed Shadowbringers, would feature an incredibly memorable final boss, Hades, aka Emet-Selch. Unbeknownst to the player, Emet-Selch had been manipulating events for many years, even acting as a pseudo-friendly companion like Elgo in Final Fantasy Dimensions. But as had been true for many prior Final Fantasy XIV final bosses, everything would culminate in one big epic showdown, as opposed to there being introductory battles beforehand. This epic showdown would take place within a trial known as the Dying Gasp. With Emet-Selch transforming into the demonic Hades, players would take part in an encounter that put their abilities to the test. It would utilise elements from the many final boss encounters seen within Final Fantasy XIV before, including transformations, multiple phases, the summoning of allies, instant fail states, stage changes, plenty of abilities designed to keep players on their toes, and even the notion of scale. And this would dwarf Shinryu, as during Hades' third phase, it would transform into its true self. And instead of just appearing outside of the stage, this meant Hades was almost all-encompassing, wrapping its appendages around the sides. With this fight also including an active time maneuver that would see a full party wipe occur even if just one player failed, and a generous checkpoint system, something seen before with Orphan in Final Fantasy XIII, it meant this fight definitely lived up to the billing and would live long in the memory. With Shadowbringers patch 5.3, dubbed Reflections in Crystals, players would then bear witness to the conclusion of the Shadowbringers story. This would see the player square off against the Warrior of Light, or Elidibus, the final Arcean. However, even though the fight itself would be potent due to the symbolism and preamble, from a mechanical perspective it was quite derivative. In order to up the ante, Elidibus would absorb the body of Ardbert to become the Warrior of Light. But even though the source was quite unique, this particular device had been used numerous times throughout the franchise, and in particular Final Fantasy XIV. The fight itself would also revert to a simpler form, but there would be one intriguing aspect. The encounter would feature two distinct phases, much like some of the earlier Final Fantasy XIV boss fights, but there would be an active time maneuver placed in between that could result in a full party wipe. The intriguing element was that the Warrior of Light would be able to use the party's own limit breaks against him, something not seen before in a final boss encounter, as they would usually rely on their own unique abilities to deal damage. Endwalker has served as the most recent expansion for Final Fantasy XIV, and the narrative roots of its final boss brought back a trait often seen within the earlier days of the franchise. Throughout the expansion, the antagonists would vary, but as the story drew to its conclusion, Meteion would be revealed as the main antagonist, merging with her sisters to create the Endsinger, an entity who wanted to end all life. This would be reminiscent of beings such as Kefka and Necron, but the method would be quite unique, as the Endsinger wanted to end life by singing. Following the transformation, due to the sheer size of the Endsinger, players would be again fighting an enemy who was not part of the stage itself, something that had now become the norm with Final Fantasy XIV's final bosses. The fight itself would also be quite intense, with many mechanics fighting for the player's attention. This would include objects colliding with each other, some adds that shot projectiles, and others that created growing pools that needed to be avoided. To make things more complicated, it would also be possible to fall off the stage, and after the initial phase was finished, a mechanic used within the Final Fantasy VII Remake would return, albeit in a slightly different form. It would see the Endsinger summon Cacodemon while charging its despair gauge. If the Cacodemon was not defeated before the gauge filled, the player would witness a game over. And it would be similar to Sephiroth, as if he was not defeated before his countdown ended, the player would also lose. The fight would also go full circle with Final Fantasy XIV's final bosses, as partway through the encounter, the Endsinger would use Ultimate Fate, causing the player to lose. But it would be a fake out, as the player would be brought back, willed on by the Scions, and receiving the Prayer of Hope buff. This would not only be reminiscent of many previous final boss encounters in the franchise as a whole, but also the revised version of the fight against La Habrea within A Realm Reborn. It meant that the Endsinger would be composed of a mixture of recurring traits associated with Final Fantasy XIV's previous final bosses, as well as some intriguing traits from the wider franchise. But it will certainly be interesting to see what ends up happening as the story of Endwalker reaches its conclusion later on this year. Either way, we're now at the end of this evolutionary side study, and we hope you're all satisfied with how we've broken down the mechanics of the numerous Final Fantasy XIV final bosses to have been featured within the game so far. We would of course love to hear your comments below for which final boss you feel has been the best implemented from a gameplay perspective, and of course if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving us a like. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, The Livestream, Elsa, Claire Farron, Galcian D. Kujata, Gregory, Justin Dent, Lord of Morning, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.